Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's my great privilege to welcome you all here. My name is István Kiss. I'm the Executive Director of the Danube Institute, a think tank based here in Hungary. And it's my great privilege to introduce Dr. Stokes, who's a professor at the University of Exeter and also special advisor at the Egyetem Institute in the UK. And also I think he's one of the foremost experts actually on American foreign policy. So it's a great privilege to have him here with us. The topic of the discussion today is kind of very broadly the decline of the West. I don't usually like kind of these generalizations, and also when I hear a lot of these kind of defeatist talks about the end of the West, decline of the West, I always kind of think that it's not really new. So it's coming from at least, I think, Edward Gibbon when he wrote about the decline of the Roman Empire after the French Revolution. But, you know, we could say Malthus, Oswald Spengler. So it's not really a new thing to talk about the decline or the end of the West. And I guess my first question to you, Doug, would be do you think things have changed significantly? Is the West really more in decline than, let's say, it was 100 years ago or after the French Revolution? Or is it kind of just a kind of a fad to talk about this?
I think that it's a complicated question, but it's a fantastic question. And first, it's wonderful to be here, so thank you so much for coming along to this. I think that the West is actually in a much better shape than we think it is, but I think that there are a number of elements to it that are undermining the social contract in the West. The first obvious one is a sort of, at least in the UK, a policy of repudiation, which essentially is based on a complete sense of endless critique of Western civilization and a sort of philosophical desire to deconstruct Western civilization, which draws from various social theories like Foucault, Derrida, etc., and post-colonial theorists. I think that's a very strong element in social theory, and in particular the Anglophone world. I'd like to think that Hungary hasn't been infected quite as much as it has in the Anglophone world, but it has massive cultural effects because it's linked to the Americans, and it has had massive cultural effects in the UK, given our very close link to the Americans. So there's a deconstructive philosophy that rejects rational adjudication, sees social life as an endless power struggle. It kind of draws on Nietzsche and Foucault, and it rejects any notion of truth or rational adjudication of truth claims, which is deeply problematic. The second big element, obviously, is globalization and what it's done to the Western social contract. We've seen globalization. There's now a kind of increasing critique of globalization and a move away from globalization, deglobalization, onshoring, friendshoring, and these kinds of elements that we see. But globalization, I think, has also led to forms of supranational governance, which has had quite profound implications for national sovereignty, forms of national dignity and culture, and the social contract between the state and the people. And we saw various rebellions against that, not least of which has been the Brexit vote in my country. And I think that cleavage around the popular sovereignty or national sovereignty versus supranationalism will be one of the deepest cleavages that define Western politics going forward for quite a while now. The third major element, obviously, is accompanying this form of supranational governance that we see is the rise of what I guess we could call a sort of technocratic class, often within these forms of global governance, which often rules through a politics of risk and vulnerability. It pushes a kind of snake oil narrative and moral panic narrative of endless forms of vulnerability, and therefore you have to give them more power to protect you from these forms of risk and risk mitigation. Climate change, net zero, blah, blah, blah. Not saying these things aren't necessarily true, but it's more important about how they chime with forms of supranational governance. And again, what that means for the nation state, national sovereignty, and human dignity. So I'll wrap this up. So those are the three major elements I think are quite pertinent to forms of decline. But if you look at the hard data, I don't think the West is materially in decline. There are deep problems in the West, but I think what we're now seeing in a far more pertinent sense is the eclipse of the liberal international order that was really the key characteristic of the post-war international system under America's strategic superintendence. America, as the lead state in the West now, it's far less willing to carry the burden of forms of international security superintendents or to underwrite forms of globalization, not least with the rise of China, not least with the Ukraine conflict and how that could drag the West in. So what I think we're seeing is, I think the West is materially, and going forward, there are bigger issues, demographics, we can talk about that if you want. But I think the main problem really is that cleavage between supranational governance, globalization, a sense of self-confidence and self-belief, and how changes in American grand strategy will affect forms of regional and world order going forward.
Thank you, Doug. I think it's interesting because, I mean, what you said is kind of my feeling as well, but if you look at statistics, of course, let's say the share of the West in global economy is declining. There's some tendencies which might not be very encouraging, but still, I mean, materially speaking, perhaps we've never been so rich, we've never been so privileged in a sense than what we are now. And still you have this feeling that a lot of people think that this is the most terrible system in the world, which is kind of strange. And I think if the West is actually in decline, it's in decline because of our own fault, basically, because we allow it to be in decline because of our mentality. And I think here, universities are crucial. And if I look at your new book, you write a lot about how things went wrong, especially in the UK universities. And I think that's something which we have to talk much more about, because we have this self-defeating defeatist attitude towards our culture, towards our heritage. And I think we Hungarians, and as you mentioned, because of our history, because we have been part of the communist Eastern Europe, we like to think that we are partly vaccinated against this. Hopefully it's not like the COVID vaccine, that you have to get revaccinated all the time. It's more like the polio or something like that, but it gives you eternal immunity. But I think here, if we would ask most university students here, they not necessarily understand a lot of these woke politics in universities, because we never had colonies, we never had slavery. If anything, Hungary has been colonized by bigger European powers, although we wouldn't necessarily call it that, but I think it's, to some extent, actually, it's very similar. And that's why it's kind of hard for us to understand. I mean, I regularly give interviews to left-leaning or left-wing media from America, and they kind of very guiltily ask me, how can you say you're proud of your history, or you're proud of your Christian heritage? And I was always say, how wouldn't I? I mean, perhaps this is the Hungarian unique perspective, but I mean, it's not saying that we don't have bad things in our history. I mean, we had the Holocaust. I mean, Hungarians participated in that. We did bad stuff, but that shouldn't define us. There's also a lot of good stuff. And I think a lot of these people forget that Western civilization is the only civilization which voluntarily actually got rid of, I mean, perhaps not the Americans, but certainly the British, got rid of slavery. And that's because of our Christian heritage. A lot of Christian organizations were involved in that fight against slavery, but also a lot of other kind of social values we have. I really think we wouldn't have human rights without, let's say, Christianity. So I'm kind of babbling around here now, but what I really want to look at is how do you see, could you kind of explain to us Hungarians what went wrong in universities, and if you have any ideas how we could, you know, kind of change things and get back this self-confidence which we would, I think, need to succeed in our civilization.
Well, I don't really wish to preach to you guys, because I'm British, and I think Hungary's got an incredible history, an incredibly rich history. What I would say on your point about the colonization is, if you think about the concept of geopolitics, what is geopolitics? Geopolitics is how a state's foreign policy and security policy and national identity is geographically configured around a geography. So if you're Hungary in Eastern Europe, and traditionally has been swept over by Nazism and communism and other forms of, you're in a very different geopolitical space than you are from the UK. So if you think about the United Kingdom, it has the luxury of a massive moat. At its smallest point, it's 21 miles, i.e. the sea. So it's the stopping power of water is always big. So I always find that very curious in terms of the castigation of East European states, Hungary included, in terms of its history. But then you look at the history of its colonization, the Ottomans, etc. So it's really interesting in terms of how your national identity and your cultural narratives are often dependent upon where you're geographically located, and also, therefore, your foreign and national security policies are very, very important. It's partly what the EU was all about. The EU, if you scratch away the surface, is really about the constitutionalization of German power, the settlement of the German problem in the post-war international system. Essentially, if you've got an economic hegemon, Germany will always be an economic hegemon, you tend to have the rise of military hegemony, military power. And when Germany gets too big militarily, then history really begins to happen. So in many senses, the EU is about the constitutionalization of German power. So that was the point in terms of, there's an interesting point about geography and geopolitics and how that structures the state's foreign and national security policy and your sense of national identity. That's a very important point. On the universities, again, I can't speak to Hungary. I would like to think you guys are much more sensible than us UK people in our universities, where we've been consumed by a sort of American race war tsunami that's come out post-George Floyd. I mean, just touching on some of your points about the history of slavery, it's as if, first and foremost, as I'm sure everybody knows, slavery has been ubiquitous throughout human history. Even the transatlantic slave trade, as disgusting, as terrible, and as stain on the soul of humanity that was. There was a long pre-existing Arab slave trade throughout, much bigger than the transatlantic slave trade. And in terms of African slavery, you get this kind of fantasy politics that Africa was one big Garden of Eden, where people sat around the beach sipping pina coladas and Bloody Marys. Forget about it. Africa was composed of kingdoms and tribes, all slaving each other. There was a movie recently, a Hollywood Wakanda-like movie called the Queen, or it was like the Warrior Queen, all right? And that was a celebration of what was the Dahomey Kingdom, a black kingdom. The Dahomey Kingdom was a massive slave kingdom based in Nigeria that conquered the Igbos. It was a Yoruba kingdom that conquered the Igbos. And essentially, it was a Wakanda-like celebration of a black slave society, Dahomey. Anyway, I mean, so in my sense of that, in the book, and I draw this out, is that's patronizing. That's deep, because what you're doing is you're saying, we're imposing a Eurocentric conception of history on a very diverse kingdoms and histories, and that's deeply unfair and deeply patronizing. And so in the universities, we've had a very strong decolonizing narrative that is dripped in kind of upper middle class guilt about a very kind of warped version of history. Number one, a British history, but then it's pushed throughout the institutions, is constantly pushed and bombarded throughout the institutions. And in terms of how this has really infected the university system, it's mainly because we've got, on the one hand, you've got a kind of consumer students now, very much seen as consumers, no longer people that are there to learn and to work hard and to grow their minds, but they're as consumers. It's like you walk into a Big Mac university. I'll have a Big Mac day car, and I'll have a sort of Derrida and Foucault fries, please. So it's very much the consumer mentality. So you've got to keep the consumers happy. So then you've also got the growth of an executive class in universities, but also across public institutions in the UK, where they sort of see their holy mission. How do they justify it? In the collapse of moral authority and in the collapse of intellectual authority, how then do you reinscribe a moral mission? You do it through saving people and identifying these vulnerable groups. And then you give the technocrats the power to save these groups. They define the problem. These are the risks. Endless isms and ists, racism and sexism and transgenderism and blah, 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 blah. Endless risks. And therefore then these people have executive fiat to define the problem and to save those people, these vulnerable groups. Give me more power to save these risk populations. And anybody that stands up and says, hang on a minute, you're undermining intellectual diversity, you're undermining truth, you're pushing a very kind of politicized ideology, then you're immediately on the wrong side of history. You're a moral monster. You're a bad person. You're evil. So that's how it works.
But isn't that a bit counterproductive? So you mentioned that universities are becoming kind of services, and I felt that when I was studying in Edinburgh, actually. It was very different to what I had experienced here in Hungary. which I think is in this sense much more old-fashioned. But I mean, if you get degrees which are not worth anything because they are gender studies or God knows what, then why would people pay for that? So I think it's kind of strange that on the one hand, yes, we see universities as these service-oriented somethings where you pay, you get your degree, and then you get a better job. But I mean, half of these degrees or a third of these degrees might not be very worthwhile in the market. So wouldn't that mean that eventually this kind of bubble will burst?
Well, that's a very good point. I mean, I personally, if you want to study gender studies or sociology or whatever you want to do, anthropology, I think these are very interesting subjects. If you wish to study these things, go for it. But I think where it becomes very problematic in the UK, again, I'm not speaking about Hungary, but in the UK, is that often these young people are doing these degrees because they're intellectually curious, which is entirely fair enough, we should respect that. But then they do these degrees and then they come out with huge debts, £50,000, £60,000. And in the UK, there's a current default rate on those debts where they're not being paid back of about 45 to 50%. So they're projected out by 2050, it's something like £500 billion will be on the taxpayer's pocket to pay for these degrees, where the students that have got these degrees aren't earning enough to pay them back. So these aren't doing these degrees aren't social justice. What you're doing is you're invariably saddling young people with extraordinarily high levels of debt, making them work extraordinarily hard, paying back quite high interest rates, by the way, and invariably they can't outrun these things. They're running to stand still. In many cases, they're running to go backwards, and that lands up on the British taxpayer. I think Australia, I could be wrong, but I think Australia has some innovations recently where they said they looked at the outcomes, the graduate outcomes of various graduates and studies and courses that you do, and they said, well, if you wish to do a degree, to use your example, István, gender studies, and no disrespect to gender studies, by the way, but if you wish to do that and the outcomes are you're earning not very much at all and you're never going to repay it, then the course fees that you need to pay to do that, to make sure it doesn't land on the public sector, on the taxpayer's pocket, is going to be much higher. So they have differential prices now, charging for degrees. You want to do engineering or computer science or physics or whatever, you pay not that much. You want to do gender studies or whatever, then you pay much, much more. And essentially it's putting that risk profile into the charging structure. And I think that something like that should happen in the UK. Not in terms of punishing courses or punishing these subjects. I don't agree with that. But just having more cognizance and awareness that if you wish to do these things, there's not only has there been a very kind of let's say an odd cultural effect in the Anglophone world as a result of these subjects, which often do push. I'm being very polite, by the way. But if I'm really being honest, they do push a very sort of odd political agenda, which is having massive effects. But essentially, if you have that differential fee structure, at least then it's not landing up on the public sector's pocket.
But I guess it's not just the universities, so it's much deeper going. And my fear is that coming from a post-communist country, sometimes I see these efforts to, you mentioned this Warrior Queen movie, to kind of rewrite history or put them in a very different context. So a very interesting experience I had, I'm not sure if this is actually the name of the museum, but it's something similar. So in Washington, D.C., you have this Museum of the Afro-American, which is a fairly new museum, and it's actually very well done. It's very interactive, very nice. But if you look at kind of the history of slavery, I mean, there's only just very small print on actually what you talked about, that slavery was not invented by the West. So you go to this museum and you go away with this feeling that, I mean, because of slavery you have America, and because of slavery you have the West power and everything, and it's almost like the West invented slavery, while it's been existent since time immemorial. I mean, the Greeks had it, the Persians had it, ancient Israel had it, so, but also African kingdoms have it, the Arabs were very much involved. But other kind of museums, I sometimes have this feeling. I mean, a much older case in New York, the National Science Museum. I mean, that older kind of different regional created stuff now have these big warning signs that, I mean, this has been made in the 70s, 80s, 90s. It might be insensitive, yada, yada. But also they changed. So, for example, the Latin American place, they removed shrink heads. They removed kind of what they say culturally insensitive stuff. So they tried to show these Indians in a more favorable light, I guess. I'm not sure. It's kind of strange that they are doing this. But I have this fear that they are, I mean, as I said, the communists tried it here in Hungary, I think it was much more crude, and people kind of know it wasn't true. But I still think a lot of people believed that kind of historic narratives. But now, because it's been portrayed everywhere, and it's kind of very voluntaristic through Hollywood, through everything. But also, I think from primary schools as well. I mean, Hungary got a lot of flack when they introduced this so-called child protection law, which they said it was anti-homosexual, yada yada. But I think, honestly, I mean, if you look at the language of that law, it's trying to push out gender propaganda from primary schools, which me as a parent, I'm kind of happy. So I don't think in kindergartens children should be taught about transgenderism or sex at all. I mean, it's not just about transsexual or homosexual stuff. We don't really want, naked males coming in there talking about heterosexual sexual life either, because that's not for kindergarten or, 8-year-old kids in primary school. So I'm just thinking that what can we do to kind of reverse this, because my fear is that 20, 30, 40 years from now, we will have a similar discussion and the students here would basically lynch us because they will think we're these crazy arch-conservative lunatics. Because from primary school they will begin learning that, slavery is a Western thing, all these kind of usual things. And I want to talk a bit about kind of the demographic decline of the West as well, but I think partly that's because of schools as well. I mean, you learn that you don't have to have babies, or women shouldn't care about that, and it's really embedded in the school system. So my question really here is that, do you see a way where we could turn this back?
In terms of like the hard data and facts, the one thing I'd say that the West, and not just the West, but other countries too, and we can come onto that if you want, really do face a problem is demographic decline. And that is a major problem. It's not just for the West. The UK, because of high immigration, hasn't got that problem. I think Hungary now has turned the corner in terms of its demography. Why is that a problem? Because you're going to get loads and loads of old people and not enough young people working to pay taxes to keep the services going. That's a massive problem. But it's not just the West that faces that. So China now, I mean, we could talk a bit about geopolitics or if you wanted to, but I know Xi Jinping is currently in town. But if you look at China, people talking about China being the next great power and all the rest of it. Yes, it is an incredible civilization, a massive, beautiful, wonderful history. It's incredible. But in terms of its potential pole within a multipolar international system, China really faces big problems in terms of demography. At the moment, it's about 1.2 billion Chinese. By 2050, there'll be 700 million. So they're really, really dropping fast. And so in terms of hard data, if you look at the demography, that's really baked in. There's not much you can do about that. That's not dependent upon cultural narratives or the story that you tell yourself. It's ultimately, there's kind of hard data. So China really does face a problem, as does many Western nations too. So, I mean, to cut a long story short, we do definitely need to have more babies, just in not just the West, but in general. I mean, otherwise that there are problems coming down the line. On the stuff about transgenderism, it's not an area of expertise for mine, but anybody that follows UK politics should really look at all the media around what was called the Cass Review that landed in the UK about 3 or 4 weeks ago. And if you look at some of the stuff that's coming out there, what's been done in hospitals to children, put on irreversible blockers, beta blockers, surgical operations to move healthy breasts, etc., and done all under the age of 18. And I think that what's going to happen from that will be prosecutions of people, and prison time will have to be served. Will they do it? I doubt it. But that's what has to happen. I mean, that's a really very serious, to do irreversible surgeries and to give young kids who are identifying. I mean, I'll give you an example. I mean, if you had an anorexic child, all right, God forbid, you had an anorexic child of 13 years old who felt she was extraordinarily fat, overweight, and then the hospital came along and said, yeah, we take your identity. We're going to give you some drugs. We're going to affirm your fatness. And they did that. Think about that. I mean, how different is this stuff? So, I mean, if you're over 18, it's a different kettle of fish. There's a whole different story there. But in terms of the social contagion of this, but then the affirmation of this for children and doing irreversible surgeries, and given them drugs, which basically means they'll never experience puberty for life. That's a whole different, you've crossed a major red line there, really. So in my honest opinion, I think that people that have pushed that ideology and done that for children, that's different. They need to be prosecuted.
But I think that actually might be happening. So I think there's more and more cases where people change their mind in their 20s and they are suing some of these clinics. And one of them actually had to close in the UK quite recently. So I think that might come. But let's turn to a bit more on geopolitics. So I think we established that the West have some problems. But of course, the main, I would say, competitor is China, which you already mentioned faces its own problems. And I tend to agree. I think China kind of reached that same demographic trap, so to speak, which the West or countries like South Korea, Taiwan, Japan has reached as well, but in a much lesser developed stage, perhaps. So they're still kind of on a developing path, but they already reached that very low demographic because of the one-child policy, I guess. And I think it's very difficult to see how they can change that and how they can maintain economic growth. So if we talk about the decline of the West, what is the alternative? So can China be a world-leading power? And also, I mean, if I stay with this, is conflict between, let's say, the West and China avoidable, or is it something which is, I mean, it's just in the system and it will eventually always happen?
Well, my answer is slightly complicated. On the one hand, I perfectly welcome China's rise. I think, you know, if you look at the development of China, but East Asia in general, it's been a massive success story. 300, 400 million people have been dragged out of poverty. China in the 1960s had a lower GDP than Sub-Saharan Africa. So it's been an incredible success story, and I think that should be that's wonderful and welcome. But obviously, the problem from a geopolitical perspective is when a state gets very rich, it wants to be slightly more military hegemonic and adventurous. I think that my opinion on China is I'm less optimistic about its capacity to sustain its power over the long term. China really has benefited from the liberal international order and globalization, which has been superintended and birthed and maintained by the Americans. And what we've seen in the last, since Trump really, but Biden's done it too, with the Inflation Reduction Act, etc., has been a real push towards protectionism and a sort of process of deglobalization, onshoring and friendshoring. And I think that is really now beginning to affect China's economy. Foreign direct investment is pulling out of China big time in fears of potential conflict over Taiwan. And China still essentially is a manufacturing hub. It's nicked, it's stolen quite a lot of intellectual property and etc. But it's reverse engineering. Even then, a lot of its manufacturing, it has to rely upon components and parts that come from other parts of the world. So given the lot that goes in through the sea, in the event of a conflict or the ratcheting up of tensions, it'd be very, very easy to close the Chinese economy down in terms of its imports and exports on the sea. It's also in a very tough neighbourhood. Again, the UK is surrounded by water, but America has got the Pacific and the Atlantic. China has maritime security issues, obviously with South Korea, Japan, Thailand, the Philippines, Singapore, etc. But it also has massive land borders. So it has a massive land border with India, and I think India and China, they've gone a little bit funny over, on the Himalayas and stuff like that. So essentially, it's got a lot of strategic dilemmas. It's got maritime and land security issues. So you have that going on. So I think, and then the demographic issue in China is a big one. If you're a manufacturing nation and you have to export your products, and those products can be shut down quite quickly in the event of a conflict, or you rely upon an internal market, but your population is absolutely going down massively, 1.3, 1.2 billion to 700 million people by 2050, then again, that doesn't necessarily portend longevity in terms of your capacity to sustain yourself economically and therefore be a major pole in the international system. And then who does it have in terms of its alliances? It has basically North Korea. Who else? Not that many. It has Russia now. Russia will always be a frenemy of China. China's got its eyes on parts of Russia's territory. There's been a lot of tension between the two historically, so we'll see where that goes. And there's always the capacity for Russian nationalism to rise if China gets more adventurous in terms of its Siberian acquisitions and other stuff like that in Central Asia. So there's a lot of interesting stuff going on there. I think that my prediction, I'm looking at the time and running out of time, but my prediction is I think that we are in a more multipolar international system, and that isn't necessarily a bad thing, but I think America will still be by far, by a long, long way, the preeminent and dominant power going forward in the 20th century. So multipolar, but America's up here, and then other poles are quite a long way backwards down here. International reserve currency status, the demography is very, very strong, incredible military. The stuff the American military is developing now is insanely good. Believe me, they've got some really good stuff going on. Security alliances are very strong. What you'll likely see is more buck passing on the part of the Americans to the Europeans in terms of their own security. The Ukraine crisis has really put that on steroids. But essentially, the Americans have said, look, you've had a lot of fun in the post-war international system and the unipolar moment after the end of the Cold War, but now things are getting slightly more serious. We've got major powers like China and Russia to a lesser extent, but still very militarily powerful, has nuclear weapons. You Europeans are rich, and you've dined out, you've sort of security freed on us for a long time. So if Trump wins, I think we'll see a rapid acceleration of buck passing from the Americans to the Europeans in relation to NATO. If Biden wins, then I think that the timeline on that will be slightly slower, but I think it's an inexorable journey towards an American-light European security infrastructure, which then itself throws up lots of interesting questions about European security. What does France do? What does the UK do? Poland now is getting some really good kit. It's taking its defence and security very, very seriously. It's bought some very, very good kit from the Americans, plus from the South Koreans. So Poland now has obviously got an eye on the future, and it wants to sort of in Poland, if it's not already within the next 5 years, will be the preeminent land power in Europe. So essentially, as the American NATO washes out, what you're going to see now is greater the re-emergence of geopolitics in Europe. The EU will keep it on the road a little bit. NATO will keep it on the road a little bit. But we are in for a new era of sort of national security in Europe, I think.
Well, I still have millions of questions, but I'm kind of looking at the time, and we're slowly running out. So I think I would open it up now to the audience. So if anybody has questions, raise their hands, and hopefully somebody will bring them microphones. But I guess if not, you can just try to be loud. I guess the gentleman here in the front.
Do I have any practical policy suggestions for UK government? Yes, quite a few. Aside from all the domestic hoo-ha, I'm not going to go into that, the Tory party, the Conservative party, otherwise we will be here for about 4 weeks. And you're young, but I don't think you want to be here for 4 weeks. I don't, I know that. I do actually, but that's another story. Practical. In terms of security and geopolitics, I presume that's what you mean. What I would say is this: the UK has to really sort out procurement. It's got a lot of like parasites that have been sucking on the defence budget for too long, making substandard crappy kit. So I think we could get away with that in the era of counterinsurgency and relying on the Americans. But we are, as I've tried to underline here, in a very different period now. We're in an era of new great power for competition and the rise of security dilemmas in the European context. So I think the UK, what it should do is it should really spend more on its military, and that's a good thing. You don't get peace by being nice to people and singing Kumbaya. You get peace through deterrence by being strong. If you attack me, I'm going to whack you. That's how you ultimately get peace in an anarchic self-help world, which is what we've got. So I think the UK should spend more on its defence, and it should lean more heavily into working with our friends and allies in Europe. And more broadly, at longer term, and we had a discussion yesterday at a wonderful lunch István hosted for us, I think that we need to sort out the Russia thing. And what do I mean by that? I mean, Russia's there. It's a great power. It's a great civilization. And longer term, we need a dignified structure for Russian engagement. And I think my personal take on it is that there's been a kind of failure in the post-Cold War international system to reform the NATO into a post-Cold War security architecture that could incorporate Russia's national security interest. It's a great failure on all of our parts that Russia isn't part of our club, isn't within, and we don't have a dignified security architecture that respects the genuine national security interests of the Russians, where they drew the red line in Ukraine. I don't want to go into the Ukraine thing, but do you see what I mean? So I think longer term, we can't ever settle European geopolitics unless we have a peace and some sort of relationship with Russia. And whether that, and I think that the road to that would be a post-NATO security architecture that incorporates Russia in a dignified and respectful way within a European club. Otherwise, we're going to keep having these conflicts, keep having human conflict. Who wants these things? And so I think that's been a major failure on all of our parts, is not to acknowledge that. And I'd like to think, and the optimist in me would like to think, longer term, post-Ukraine, God willing, we can hopefully reincorporate or have that rapprochement with Russia, because we need it. We need it.
It might be lost, sadly, but I mean, we talked about this yesterday as well, and I mean, as a Hungarian, I mean, if anybody has reason to not like the Russians, it's Hungarians, and I don't think we really like them. But it's there, and we don't really think it will go away, as you mentioned as well. And I'm always kind of surprised about this kind of irrational thinking towards Russia coming from actually most of the UK and kind of the former Commonwealth. Some Americans as well. I'm not sure if it's from the Cold War or why is this, but it's kind of strange to see as a Hungarian.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not. I mean, obviously, what Putin has done in Ukraine, etc. That's one thing. But in terms of that Russia phobia or that, I mean, it's kind of
like talks. Then I mean, it's almost actually racist. So I mean, if you would talk about like these terms about black people or something like that, it wouldn't be allowed. So I mean, I regularly hear very kind of senior people telling stuff that, oh, it's in their DNA. The Russians are like this. They will always try to occupy everything because it's in their DNA, and it's like, I mean, strange.
Well, I mean, in terms of the castigation, I agree. We have to be respectful. But I'm coming from purely from a sort of national security interest, and that is if the national security interests of the UK, but more broadly the European powers, is ideally invested in some kind of framework of peace, where we don't keep seeing international conflicts. Whatever we may think of the Russians, the facts are they are there and they have their own interests. So I think the best thing would be some sort of post-NATO security architecture that recognises that in some sort of cooperative form, so we can dial this back. Conflict and war and endlessly having to worry, not least because Russia has nuclear weapons, and Putin and members of Russia's security elites have intimated on a number of occasions the potential use of tactical nuclear weapons. So it's really in all of our interests to find a post-Putin or a post-Ukraine solution that sees a resolution of these international security issues.
I still think we have at least time for one question because we started a bit late. I see a hand back there. I'm not sure if you have a microphone, but I guess I will give you mine.
I want to go back to the demographic decline topic. And you said that the demographic decline is somehow connected to women being taught that they do not have to have children. And couldn't it be that demographic decline is because it's just too expensive to raise kids? Because you have to be financially stable, and that's not really easy to achieve these days.
I don't think. No, István just said it. I said that bit, so I didn't say that bit. I think there's a very complicated reasons why we're seeing demographic decline. But I think the underlying question there was about the social contract with the young people. And again, this is something we discussed at lunch yesterday. I completely agree. If you across Europe, but also in Australia and the United States, there is a housing crisis, and if you can solve the housing issue, you can really solve a lot of the big problems that face the West. young people want to ultimately to settle down. They want children. They want security, and they want dignity. And unfortunately, in the UK, I'll stick with the UK. I know it best. The housing crisis has meant that young people are delaying families. Responsible young people are delaying having children because they can't afford the houses. They have to live in substandard accommodation. Or live with their parents often until sometimes in their 30s or sometimes in their 40s. So I think the housing crisis, I think that's a major issue that needs to be solved. And again, we were having a discussion yesterday. The UK has a massive housing crisis. The rents are incredibly high. People can't afford to buy houses. But only 6% of the UK is actually built upon. 6% of the UK is actually built upon, and 2% of that 6% are parks and open green spaces. So in terms of urban conurbation, the mass areas where people actually live, only 4% of the UK is actually built upon. So we have huge amounts of land. You fly over the UK, it's just endless fields and greenery. That's a wonderful thing, of course. But so there's loads and loads of space. So why aren't we building houses? It's a question of political will. Like so much of this declinism, it's related to how we've trapped ourselves in these forms of regulatory risk and governance, and we're stopping ourselves from doing things that after the Second World War, there was mass house building, the National Health Service was set up in the United Kingdom, mass education. We need that sense of renewal and re-injection of faith to do that again. And so to go to the question, I think you're right. The demographic decline element is also partly related to much broader issues, and one of the big ones is housing. I'm looking at it's just run out of time, I think, but that was a great question. Thank you.
I'll stole your microphone. Sadly, we're out of time, but I just wanted to say a couple of thoughts because I think I mentioned that. I just mentioned this as one problem, so I fully agree with the question. I think there's several reasons why young people don't have more kids, and one of the most important are actually economic reasons. And I think that is kind of unique in what's going on in Hungary. I mean, we can debate how successful that it is, but I like that idea that they think that they can change young people's minds by giving these economic benefits to people who are willing to have 2, 3, 4 children and have these economic incentives in place. Because I really think if you look at countries even like Sweden, some of the most progressive states, women want to have more children than they currently have. And if you ask them why don't they usually say economic reasons. So I think it's really crucial to kind of look into that, solve that, but also quite honestly, I mean, my grandparents' generation, my grandfather, they were 7 children and they were living in one room. So, I mean, I think it's a lot of things, but also I think there's a lot of kind of mentality problems as well, because I'm not sure, I mean, I have a house now where we have 3 bedrooms for all the 3 kids we're planning to have. But I mean, it wouldn't be catastrophic if 2 children would share one room or something like that, but we're living better life. But I'm rambling again, and we're also out of time. But I would like to thank Doug for joining us today. It was a real pleasure to talking to you, and also thank you to the audience who stayed with us, especially during kind of almost lunchtime. Thank you for being with us. Have a nice day.